The old Ford pickup groaned, a symphony of protesting metal against the rising incline. As Mark wrestled the wheel beside him, Sarah scrolled through her phone, a look of growing frustration on her face. In the back, Ben, ever the joker, nudged Emily with his elbow. "Last chance, Em. Still sure about this digital detox?" he quipped, gesturing vaguely at the dense wall of forest now closing in on either side of the narrow dirt track. No Insta-perfect sunset pics, no TikTok dances with bears. Emily managed a weak smile, her eyes already scanning the looming, ancient trees. "It's about escaping, Ben. Getting back to something real." Her voice, usually light, held an unusual tremor, a subtle undercurrent of apprehension. Mark grunted, gears grinding. "Real enough, Emily. This is the Blackwood National Forest. We're heading deep into a section that sees maybe a dozen hikers a year. Cellular service dropped out 50 miles back." Sarah sighed dramatically, lowering her phone. 55, actually. And my battery's almost dead anyway. This better be worth it, Mark. All that training, all the new gear for what, exactly? Perspective, Sarah, Mark replied, his gaze fixed on the uneven track. He was the most experienced outdoorsman of the group, a self-appointed leader whose meticulous planning usually verged on obsession. He'd mapped out a challenging 4-day loop, promising breathtaking vistas and an unparalleled sense of wilderness immersion. The forest swallowed them whole. Ancient cedars and towering pines clawed at the sky, their lower branches creating a perpetual twilight even in the afternoon sun. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the smell of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something indefinable, a raw, primeval scent that hinted at untamed vastness. They parked at the edge of a barely discernible trail, the truck looking pitifully small against the backdrop of the colossal trees. The silence that descended when Mark killed the engine was profound, almost oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of city noise, it was an active, heavy quiet that seemed to press in on their ears. "All right, Tim," Mark announced, pulling his pack from the truck bed. "Let's hit it. 2 hours to our first designated campsite." The initial hours were invigorating. The trail, though overgrown in places, was passable, and the sheer majesty of the old-growth forest was undeniable. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, illuminating shafts of dust motes dancing in the humid air. Ben kept spirits high with exaggerated complaints and surprisingly accurate bird calls. Sarah, despite her earlier skepticism, found herself captivated by the intricate patterns of moss on ancient rocks. Emily, however, remained quieter than usual, her head constantly turning, her eyes darting into the deeper shadows. "You okay, Em?" Mark asked at one point, noticing her distant gaze. She jumped slightly. "Yeah, just it's so quiet." "Too quiet sometimes. Like everything's holding its breath." Mark chuckled. "That's nature, ma'am. Not a subway station." They reached their first campsite, a small, relatively flat clearing beside a babbling creek just as the sun began its slow descent. Tents were pitched quickly, a fire started with practiced ease. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar trees into monstrous silhouettes. Dinner was rehydrated wilderness stew, surprisingly palatable, followed by hot chocolate. As night deepened, the forest truly came alive, not with sound, but with presence. The air grew heavy. The rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth seemed magnified. Emily huddled closer to the fire, pulling her fleece tighter around her. "I keep feeling like we're being watched," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper above the crackle of the fire. Ben scoffed, though his eyes too were sweeping the perimeter. "It's just your imagination, Em. Probably a deer, or a squirrel getting its last meal." Sarah, always the pragmatist, chimed in, "Or a coyote. We're in their territory, after all." Mark, however, was silent, his gaze fixed on the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight. Had felt it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a weight pressing down from the surrounding woods. But he dismissed it as the natural unease of deep wilderness. Later, huddled in his sleeping bag, Mark found sleep elusive. He heard Sarah shift in her tent, Ben's light snoring, and Emily's occasional, soft whimper. The silence outside was absolute again, broken only by the creek. But then, it wasn't just silence. It was a lack of sound. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hoot of an owl. It felt unnatural. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe deeply, attributing it to overactive imagination and the adrenaline of the day. The next morning, the mood was different. A thin mist clung to the ground, weaving through the trees like ghostly fingers. The vibrant greens of yesterday seemed muted, almost monochrome. The air was colder, heavier. Emily emerged from her tent looking pale and drawn. "I didn't sleep well," she admitted, rubbing her temples. "Felt a pressure, and I kept hearing something." "What kind of something?" Sarah asked, stirring a cup of instant coffee. Emily hesitated. "Not a sound, really. More like a whisper that wasn't there. Or a hum deep inside my head. And I had a dream." She shuddered. "Or a nightmare." It was just darkness. And tall things. Very tall. Ben, usually boisterous, was uncharacteristically quiet, nursing his own coffee. "My camera's acting up," he mumbled, fiddling with his digital SLR. "Battery was fully charged last night, now it's dead. And it keeps making this weird static noise when I try to turn it on." Mark felt a prickle of unease. His own GPS unit, normally reliable, had been slow to acquire satellites that morning, and its display had flickered ominously. "Probably just the damp," he said, trying to sound confident. "Forest air, electronics don't mix." They packed up and set off, deeper into the forest. The trail grew steeper, more rugged, the trees denser. The mist thickened, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. It gave the forest an ethereal, timeless quality, but also an isolating one. Each tree seemed to rise individually from the shroud, only to disappear into it again. Emily began lagging behind, frequently stopping to peer into the mist-shrouded depths. "Did you guys see that?" she'd ask, her voice hushed. "Just there. Something dark, moving between the trees." "It's just the mist, Em." Sarah would reply patiently, though she too would glance back. A faint line of worry appearing between her brows. "Playing tricks on your eyes." But Mark had seen it too, fleetingly. A vertical interruption in the swirling grey, taller than a man, darker than shadow. Head blinked, and it was gone. He blamed fatigue, the shifting mist, anything but what his gut screamed. They broke for lunch by a moss-covered boulder, the silence more pronounced than ever. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just the drip of condensation from the leaves and their own hushed breathing. Ben pulled out his phone, attempting to take a panorama. "Still getting that static on the camera," he muttered, more to himself than the others. He tried his phone camera instead. It clicked, but the resulting image was a distorted mess of horizontal lines and faded colors, like a badly tuned analog TV. He scrolled through his photos from yesterday. Most were fine, but two, taken in the deeper parts of the trail, were similarly corrupted, with an odd, tall, dark blur in the background, easily dismissed as lens flare or a trick of the light. "That's really weird," he said, showing it to Sarah. She frowned. "Your phone's old, Ben. Probably just on its last legs." Emily, however, gasped, pointing at one of the corrupted photos. "No. Look. It's like the thing I saw. The tall, dark shape." Mark snatched the phone, examining the blurred image. It was disturbing, certainly. The tall, dark smudge in the background, barely discernible, held an unsettling quality. He remembered the legendary head dismissed as campfire stories from years ago. The ones about the tall man in the woods, the faceless entity that stalked children and adults alike. Slenderman. He pushed the thought away with a shudder. Superstition. Folklore. That evening, as they made camp in a particularly isolated grove of ancient trees, the air was thick with unspoken tension. No one joked. No one even bothered trying to get cell service. The mist had not lifted, and a fine drizzle had begun to fall, making everything slick and cold. As Mark tried to get the fire going with damp wood, Emily let out a sharp cry. "My compass. It's spinning wildly." Indeed, her small, handheld compass was rotating erratically, the needle refusing to settle on north. Mark pulled out his own, a more robust model. Its needle, too, was shivering, pointing in no discernible direction. "Magnetic interference," he stated, his voice tight. "Maybe a localized mineral deposit, or an old power line buried somewhere." He didn't believe his own explanation. He'd never encountered such strong interference. That night was the worst yet. Sleep was impossible for Mark. Every creak of a branch, every drip of water sounded like a deliberate step. He lay rigid in his tent, listening to the rain patter against the fly, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He swore he could feel eyes on him, a palpable sense of being watched, not from the trees directly outside, but from somewhere within the forest, a profound, chilling presence. He thought he heard a soft, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, but it was too regular, too deep, and it seemed to vibrate inside his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to rationalize, to dismiss, but the sound persisted. Then, he heard Emily whimper, a choked sound from her tent nearby, followed by a frantic scrabbling. "Emily," Mark whispered loudly, unzipping his tent. Silence. The thumping stopped. "Emily, are you okay?" he called out, a little louder. Another whimper, this time closer, and then a low, guttural growl that made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was not animalistic. It was too deep, too resonant, too wrong. He scrambled out of his tent, grabbing his headlamp, shining it frantically around. Sarah and Ben were already emerging from their tents, looking terrified. "What was that?" Sarah breathed, clutching her sleeping bag to her chest. "Sounded like a bear," Ben stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily was huddled at the entrance of her tent, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror. "No," she choked out. "Not a bear. It was tall and dark. It was right there. I felt it. I felt it looking at me." Her voice cracked. "And it had things. Like arms. But too many. And they moved." She pointed a trembling finger into the dark, rain-swept woods. Mark shone his powerful headlamp into the direction she pointed. Nothing. Just rain, mist, and the impenetrable wall of trees. But the growl, the one had heard, it hadn't been a bear. It had been something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The next morning, they tried to leave. The plan was to retrace their steps, hike out, and cut their trip short. But the forest seemed to have changed. The trail they had followed so diligently yesterday was gone. It was as if the trees had shifted, the undergrowth risen to swallow their path whole. "This isn't right," Mark muttered, consulting his GPS. The screen was flickering wildly now, displaying a jumble of corrupted pixels. "My compass is still useless. We need to find the trail, guys." They spent hours wandering, trying to reorient themselves. The mist remained, thick and disorienting. Every tree looked the same. Every turn led to another identical patch of dense forest. A sense of claustrophobia began to settle in, despite the vastness. Then they found them. Crude symbols etched into the bark of a centuries-old cedar. A circled X, and another, further down, guiding them deeper, not out. Emily let out a small shriek. "These weren't here yesterday. I swear they weren't." Mark's blood ran cold. He recognized the symbol from the fringes of internet lore, the Slenderman mythos, the operator symbol. He had scoffed at it, dismissed it as urban legend for bored teenagers. But here it was, undeniable, chillingly real. "We need to ignore these," Mark said, his voice strained. "They're just kids playing a sick joke. We stick to the sun's direction, try to find a ridgeline, anything familiar." But the sun was hidden behind a perpetual mist, and every ridgeline they found looked alien. The forest seemed to coil around them, a labyrinth of greens and grays, with no escape. That afternoon, Ben was the first to show severe physical symptoms. He complained of a crushing headache, then a sudden, violent wave of nausea. He vomited bile behind a bush, shaking uncontrollably. His nose began to bleed, a steady trickle down his chin. "I don't feel right," he gasped, clutching his head. "My ears are ringing, and I keep seeing flashes, like static in my vision." Sarah, pale herself, pressed a handkerchief to his nose. "We need to get him out of here now." They tried to hurry, but Ben was weakening, stumbling, his eyes glazed with pain and fear. Emily, too, was deteriorating, her earlier apprehension replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed paranoia. She was constantly turning, whispering, "Did you see it? It was right there, behind that tree. It's watching us. It never stops watching." Mark felt it too. The feeling of being scrutinized, the chilling, invisible weight of an unseen gaze. It wasn't just Emily's imagination. It was real, and it was closing in. As dusk began to paint the mist in hues of bruised purple and gray, they heard it. A faint, almost subliminal sound. Not a growl, not a whisper. It was a high-pitched, oscillating hum, like a distant, distorted radio signal, just on the edge of audibility. It seemed to vibrate in their teeth, in their very bones. Ben screamed. He wasn't looking at the trees or the ground. He was looking up, his face a mask of utter horror. Mark, Sarah, and Emily followed his gaze. There, impossibly tall, silhouetted against the deepening gloom, stood a figure. It was impossibly slender, its limbs elongated to grotesque proportions. It wore what appeared to be a dark suit, but its form was fluid, indistinct, shimmering at the edges like a heat haze. And where a face should have been, there was only a void, a smooth, terrifying blankness. It was motionless, but those limbs, they were not merely arms. They were tendrils, impossibly long and black, slowly unfurling from its back, swaying with a sickening, graceful undulation that defied all natural laws. They reached out, not quite touching the trees, but seeming to feel the very air around them, like a blind predator searching for prey. The humming intensified, becoming a piercing shriek in their minds. Mark felt a sudden, searing pain behind his eyes, a dizzying wave of disorientation. He stumbled, collapsing to his knees. Sarah gasped, tears streaming down her face. Her hands clamped over her ears, as if to ward off an unheard sound. Emily let out a broken sob, pointing a trembling finger. The entity remained silent, unmoving, watching them. Its very presence was a physical assault, twisting reality, bending light, stealing sound. It was the absolute embodiment of wrongness. They scrambled to their feet, fear lending them a desperate strength. They ran, not towards anything, just away. Away from the towering darkness, away from the impossibly long tendrils, away from the silent, faceless horror. The forest became a blur of trees and mist, a cruel, mocking maze. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs screamed in protest, until the piercing hum finally faded, replaced by the ragged sound of their own desperate breathing. They didn't stop until night had fully descended, black and absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering light of Mark's headlamp. They collapsed in a heap, deep in a ravine, hidden by thick undergrowth, too terrified to even attempt to fire. No Oni spoke. No one dared. The silence that had once been merely unsettling was now a tangible, chilling entity, a void that held the promise of unspeakable terrors. Ben was curled into a ball, whimpering softly, his nose still trickling blood. Sarah was crying silently, her face buried in her knees. Emily stared wide-eyed into the surrounding darkness, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. Mark tried to orient himself to think, but his mind was a storm of static and fear. The image of the towering figure, the faceless void, the impossibly long tendrils, was burned into his retinas. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were lost. Completely, utterly lost. Not just in the forest, but in something far more profound. They were no longer hikers on an adventure. They were prey, and the hunter was patient. He glanced at Emily. Her head was tilted slightly, as if listening. A faint smile, not of joy, but of a terrifying, vacant acceptance, played on her lips. Her eyes were unfocused, staring into a point beyond the veil of trees, into something only she could see. Then, Mark heard it again, faintly, at first. A rhythmic thumping, 1, 2, 3. It was close. It was coming for them. The forest was silent otherwise. Too silent. And Mark knew, with an awful, crushing certainty, that the hunt had only just begun. There would be no escape. Not from this place. Not from it. The realization was a cold, sharp blade to his heart. They were utterly, irrevocably, consumed. The rhythmic thumping, initially a faint vibration in Mark's skull, grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the steady beat of a human heart, but something deeper, more resonant, like a vast, unseen engine powering through the primeval darkness. Each pulse sent a fresh wave of panic through his chest, tightening his throat, stealing his breath. He nudged Sarah. "We have to move." His voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the thumping that now seemed to fill the entire ravine. Sarah stirred, her eyes wide and bloodshot in the dim light of his headlamp. She looked utterly spent, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Ben, still curled into a fetal position, whimpered louder, a thin, pathetic sound. Emily remained motionless, her vacant smile chilling Mark to his core. She was listening, truly listening, to something they couldn't hear. Or perhaps, she was simply gone, her mind already consumed by the terror that stalked them. The thumping pulsed again, closer still, vibrating the very earth beneath them. A low, distorted hum, akin to the buzzing of 1,000 agitated wasps, layered itself over the rhythm. It was the same sound that had heralded the faceless entity's appearance. Now, Mark hissed, scrambling to his feet. He pulled at Sarah's arm. "Sarah, get up!" With a guttural cry that sounded more animal than human, Ben convulsed. He clawed at his face, his eyes rolling back in his head, a fresh gush of blood erupting from his nose. He pitched forward, striking his head on a rock with a sickening thud, and lay still, twitching faintly. "Ben!" Sarah shrieked, tearing free from Mark's grasp, scrambling towards him. "No, Sarah, don't," Mark pleaded, but it was too late. As she reached Ben, the humming intensified, wrapping around them like an invisible, suffocating shroud. And then, from the thick undergrowth just above the ravine, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. It was immense, impossibly tall, and its form wavered at the edges, absorbing the feeble light of Mark's headlamp. Tendrils, more numerous than before, longer and